Philip Lown arrived in the U.S. penniless. That didn't last. He followed the American dream of education, work, and eventually ownership of a shoe factory in Lewiston. With Israel Bernstein, they established UJA appeal committees throughout the state so people could give back to their communities. He helped children by creating Camp Lown in Oakland and with Israel, co-founding State of Israel Bonds. His grandson, Mitch Fishman, I believe, is here to accept his award.
It's a double ceremony for my grandfather and my uncle Bernard. So I wanted the same people to be here because these are all my cousins. And in fact, every one of them went to Camp Lown, including myself. So my grandfather, who died over 40 years ago, was truly a self-made man. He came here at 17 with nothing in his pocket. He always tells the story about how he loved the United States because a Jewish committee gave him some money as soon as he got off the boat at Ellis Island, gave him an extra $1, and he had $1. He said, "I love this country. I came here, and they doubled my money immediately." So he worked in a lot of menial jobs, physical labor jobs, because when he came here at 17, he really didn't have an education. By the time he was 24, he had finished Lynn Classical High School and then went on to the University of Maine to get his degree in chemical engineering. He shared his experience in life both in Maine and in Boston. Both of them were related to Jewish education of various sorts. And the way he was able to achieve the kind of important contributions that he could do was through the manufacturing of shoes. And he had factories in Auburn, Maine. He had factories in Bangor, in Old Town, and in other places within Maine. And this allowed him to really establish a baseline so that he could provide contributions to the parts that he thought were important. One of the parts that was important to him were the Jewish children of Maine. And as was mentioned in the bio, in the early 40s, he, along with a lawyer from Portland, Maine, founded the Maine Jewish Council. And the Maine Jewish Council initially was to provide a base for raising money for the UJA so that it could be channeled to, at that time, Palestine and later Israel. But it was also an opportunity to find out what Jewish children throughout the state needed. And he actually went around to all the major cities, the 25 hamlets, and as far away as Presque Isle and Aroostook County. And what he found was that Jewish education was pretty much non-existent. And it was at that point that he founded Camp Lown. He bought the property in Oakland, Maine on the Belgrade Lakes. He provided financial support. And what I remember is a child, and I went to Camp Lown. These guys didn't go as much as I did, maybe being the oldest. I had to achieve a higher standard. But I went to Camp Lown for about 10 years, from the late 40s to the late 50s. And what I remember at Camp Lown with my grandfather was that every Friday night he would show up, and the camp would sing him a Havenu Shalom Aleichem song, welcoming him to the dinner. And he really saw the 150 or so kids, the children mostly from Maine, but from other cities in New England primarily. He saw them as his children, as people that he needed to nurture. And in fact, Camp Lown was a very cultural experience, had a lot of fun. But at the end of the summer, they had what at most camps you'd refer to as a color war. At Camp Lown, they had the Maccabean Games. And some of you, I think the Adelmans will remember that. And so you broke off into a U.S. team and then an Israeli team, and you basically, fought in competitions for that week. It made you feel like you were in Israel and you were culturally involved in the Jewish tradition. And I think that's what that intention was. So as I said, he split up Maine, and he also moved to Boston in the early 50s. And in Boston, he became a trustee of Brandeis University, founded the Near Eastern and Judaic School of Studies, and became the president of the Hebrew College. So he was very devoted to that. The other thing, which I'll say in closing, was a side of my grandfather that we collectively, all of our family, really didn't know about his participation in the state of Israel. My wife always tells the story, Carol, who's holding a camera, that when she joined the family in the 1970s, she heard about my grandfather and that he was participating in Israel and politics and in creating forests. That was a big thing in those days. You'd put your money in a pushki and then it would grow into a tree, right? And she thought, well, he's giving blankets or he's doing that. Well, what we have found in more recent years was that he was part of a major effort in 1944, 1945, to actually help finance and develop the Haganah, and more important, to actually move part of a group called the Sonnenben Group out of New York City to finance ships and other ways of getting refugees out of post-World War II Europe to Palestine, what was known at that time. The Exodus, in fact, it's somewhat of a lore, it's somewhat of a story that is not confirmed, but we think that group actually financed the Exodus, an unfortunate situation, but nevertheless quite famous. At the end of this year, a movie is coming out which is called 4 Million Bullets, and it's about the efforts of the Sonnenben Group, which is also referenced in a book by Leonard Slater called The Pledge, which came out in the 70s, about these 18 East Coast, some Midwest industrialists that participated in trying to build up Israel so that they would be able to sustain the attacks that came in the War of Independence. And in fact, the photograph that's in your program at the top of the bio is of my grandfather, Philip, shaking hands with David Ben-Gurion. And the caption that you can't see in that photograph is, "Phil, I remember that day in 1945." And that refers to when Rudolf Sonnenborn had all of these people at his house in Manhattan on Park Avenue, and that was when it began, and Golda Meir was there as well. So that's a side of my grandfather that people don't realize existed, and I think one of the reasons growing up I didn't know about that was because it actually constituted espionage, the right kind of espionage, but nevertheless sending armaments to a foreign nation is not allowed under U.S. law. And that went on, I think, that's how I'm going to end the talk, I think it went on throughout my youth, but who knows? Maybe that's another chapter. Again, I wanted to thank the group who've organized this, particularly Steve Brin, and happy to be here.
Philip Lown was born in Lithuania in 1890, son of Lubavitcher Hasidic Jews. He arrived in the U.S. at age 17, and although penniless, he worked his way through high school while learning English. He went on to the University of Maine, where he received a chemical engineering degree. While at UMaine, he helped organize the Menorah Society and start the Hillel Foundation. He then spent several years working as a chemist in Rhode Island. In 1935, he purchased a shoe factory in Lewiston and moved there with his wife, Anne, and their daughters, Dorothy and Louise. Philip Lown and Israel Bernstein formed the Maine Jewish Council and established UJA appeal committees throughout the state. He served as honorary president of the American Association of Jewish Education and established Camp Lown in Oakland, Maine, where thousands of Jewish children from New England and New York enjoyed a rich camping experience during its 30-plus year existence. In his role as honorary president of the AAJE, he worked to enrich the Jewish experience and provide knowledge to young Jews. Mr. Lown served as trustee at Brandeis University, where he launched and endowed the Philip W. Lown School of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies. He served as trustee president and board chair to the Hebrew College in Boston, and was the college's first recipient of the Medallion for Leadership in Jewish Education. His work in Israel included funding of the Lown Community Center, the Library of Education of Hebrew University, and a Hadassah program. Mr. Lown was also actively engaged with helping survivors of the Holocaust reach Palestine and in the establishment and defense of the State of Israel during the War of Independence. He was a co-founder of State of Israel Bonds, and he served as treasurer of the B'nai B'rith Hillel Commission and received the Jewish Theological Seminary of America's Medal for distinguished contribution to Jewish education.